Marlène Laruelle, who is here in this virtual space, physically present with us, but also you see her picture here on the screen. A lot of titles and a lot of jobs that she has. The director of the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies. For us, very relevant today is that she's also the director of the Illiberalism Studies Program. And I think we're probably going to hear a bit more about that later. Director of the Central Asian Program and co-director of PONAS Eurasia, research professor of international affairs at George Washington University. So that's quite a resume, and Dr. Laruelle is one of the leading experts in the world on the phenomenon of illiberalism and what illiberalism exactly is and why it's relevant and why we should care about it a great deal is something that we're going to talk about in this interview. So, Marlène, is there anything that you would like to say before we get started, or before I get started with my questions?
No, just delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, we're very grateful that you are willing to make time for us. What is illiberalism actually? Could you explain what the key features of this phenomenon are and how it relates to a term that most people are probably a bit more familiar with, namely liberalism?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. That's, of course, the key question. So for me, I see liberalism and illiberalism are in constant interaction, in dialogue, right? And I think illiberalism is always situational toward liberalism. So depending on the country, of the context, you don't have the same illiberalism because it doesn't speak to the same liberalism. And this liberalism, it can be political liberalism, economic liberalism, cultural liberalism, can be also geopolitical kind of liberal world order. So illiberalism arrive at the kind of backlash against different form of liberalism. And so for me, liberalism, it's a broad ideological family with many different nuances, but it has two key features. The first one is that it's criticizing liberalism in its different script after having experienced it. So it needs to be a backlash, a kind of post-liberalism, right? You experience liberalism and then you are unhappy with it and you backlash. And I say that because, for example, I don't consider China as illiberal. I don't consider countries which haven't gone through a liberal experience as being illiberal. They are something else, authoritarian or dictatorial, whatever, or another ideological set. And then the second kind of key element for me that illiberalism is proposing solutions that are nation-centric, so like sovereignty of the nation against multilateral institution matters, that are majoritarian, so it's kind of majoritarian system against minority rights, and it's culturally homogeneous, so there is some definition of the core of the nation as being culturally homogeneous, and therefore external groups are not very much welcome, and it's believed in traditional hierarchy, especially in relation to, family, more genders. So it's a working definition, and you can challenge it on different ways. But I think that's, once you put together these elements, that give you a kind of working definition with whom we can then play conceptually.
Yeah, thanks. So it seems that illiberalism can be different things, but there is a sort of coherent core to that. You also say, contrary to some other scholars, that we shouldn't really think of liberalism as a regime type, but rather as an ideology. Why do you think it's important to make that distinction?
Well, you see, the problem with all these new concepts when they arrive is that they are very blurry and very vague. And in liberalism, it was first mostly used by politicians and experts to denounce their political enemies. So whoever is not sharing my opinion is an illiberal was a kind of global a media narrative. And then you had some political leaders who took the term and make them the way they want to define themselves. Like Viktor Orban in Hungary is proud to define himself as an illiberal leader. And then scholars took the term and worked with it. The problem is that the majority of scholars who began working with that concept were coming from political science. And therefore, for them, illiberalism and regime types really overlaps. And you can see in the literature that, sometimes they say liberalism, sometimes they say authoritarianism. And so it's very often used to describe the nature of the regime. Now I think it's changing, because now you have a growing number of scholars who come from political philosophy or political theory, who are working with the notion. And so for them, regimes is not an issue. What matters is the ideological construction of illiberalism. And so for me, it's important to dissociate them, because I think you have authoritarian regimes that are not illiberal. They don't elaborate a doctrine of illiberalism to justify their authoritarian practices. They are just authoritarian with no narrative around. And then you can also have illiberal philosophers or thinkers who are not connected to one or another type of regime, right? So I think, of course, sometimes and often it's overlap, but I think it's important conceptually just to keep them kind of dissociated.
Yeah, so it seems that while the academic discussion is going along, we're getting a clearer image of what illiberalism actually should mean and what it doesn't mean. Still, there seems to be, I think, especially for outsiders like me, a bit of overlap between words like illiberalism and other words that you hear being bandied about a lot, like populism, conservatism, and similar terms. And it seems, especially outside academia, perhaps, that some people just use them interchangeably. When someone's a populist, he's a liberal. When he's a liberal, he is a populist, and he is a conservative. So what really distinguishes illiberalism from these other partially overlapping terms that we have? So, and speaking as an academic and a scholar, what does it gain us as an analytical tool? What does it bring to the table that other terms don't really capture in the same way?
So for me, what is bringing to the table is that it's showing that what is seen as the enemy is liberalism. And so the real discussion, it's not about, democracy, institution, representation. It's about liberalism, like belief in liberalism. And that's what is getting challenged now. And the problem with terms with like a concept like populism is that it has such a success. There has been such inflation that everything, populism is just used so broadly, even in scholarly discussion, and it's often conflated. Sometimes scholars use it as a kind of discursive strategy, right? To kind of divide us versus them, the people versus the establishment. Some other scholars see it as an ideology. I belong to those who don't see why populism is an ideology. It can be used by the left, by the right. You also have centrist populism, liberal populism. So, so if populism is everything, it means it's not an ideology. It's a rhetorical tool to attract attention. So for me, populism is a mismatch to describe what is happening in the world now, and the term illiberalism is much more relevant. Also, it's not always the same. You can have illiberal leaders that are not populist. Vladimir Putin in Russia is not a populist, he's a statist, but he's an illiberal leader. And you can have the reverse, right? You can have a liberal populism is also a possible combination.
Yeah, so he's not a populist because he doesn't really make this contrast between the elites and the people.
Exactly. On the contrary, he's saying the elites and the people are kind of fusional, right? Because the population is fusional with the state, and the state is represented by the elites, right? So it's not a populist narrative. It doesn't play on the division. It doesn't play on polarization. On the contrary, Putin is playing on unity. So it's not a populist technique, but it's an illiberal ideology. And then with conservatism, that's also an interesting discussion. I think there the overlap is serious between conservatism and illiberalism. With that difference is that conservative political party, and of course they are very different if you are in Europe or in the US, it's not the same definition of conservatism, are usually economically liberal, right? So they are conservative for values, but they are economically liberal. And they tend to respect the political, spectrum of institution and the kind of the democratic framework. While illiberalism is not economically liberal, it's much more state-oriented or much more protectionist, and it's also playing differently on the relationship to the political institution. So just think in the US framework, I mean, the Republican Party before Trump and the Republican Party after Trump, right? One is illiberal. The previous one was probably for sure conservative. Today, you have a Republican Party that is much more illiberal because it's challenging its own belief in political institution, right? Yeah. And it's also changed its narrative related to economic populism. So here also, I think all these notions and concepts, they are still in the working kind of processes, but we can see that the terms is really, I think, a better one to try to capture what is happening politically globally.
Yeah. So because illiberalism is quite a flexible term, I guess that also makes it helpful to apply it to different countries where being a liberal or a conservative means different things. And you mentioned the Republican Party, but of course, being an illiberal party in Hungary might be a different thing from what the Republican Party in the US is doing, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. Context really matters, and whatever is the nature of the political regimes also influence the political spectrum. If you are illiberal in an illiberal regime, is different than to be illiberal in a system that is still majoritarily liberal.
Yeah. So these days we often hear a lot also about wokeness and about left-wing extremists, as they're then called, who are also trying to infringe on democratic rights, at least allegedly, because they want to silence people, they want to cancel people. And there are some commentators who say this is actually also a form of illiberalism. Would you agree to that? Can there be something like left-wing illiberalism as well, or is it purely a right-wing phenomenon?
No, I think so. Here also it depends of the definitions that you want to use. It that definition depends of the kind of the positionality of the scholar themselves, right? It's a very normative question. Mm-hmm. If you take the definition I gave at the beginning of illiberalism, and that you have as one criteria to say illiberalism, you have respect for traditional hierarchy, then you don't really have a leftist illiberalism, because it's challenging traditional hierarchy, especially in terms of gender or race or ethnicity. And it's, if you take that criteria out, then you can have a leftist illiberalism in the sense of a belief that in order to challenge this traditional hierarchy of power, you need to make collective identity more important than individual identity. And that is a challenge to what is liberalism as a political philosophy, which is about all kind of individual freedom and protection from other form of collective identity. And of course, as you said, the technique of silencing some other in order to change the value system of the society. In that case, I think it fits the definition of a leftist illiberalism. But if you put the cultural, moral, aspect of everything related to ethnicity and sexuality, then it doesn't fit anymore. So here also depend on the definition you want to use.
Political views play into this a lot as well, what people would consider to be illiberal. So as an historian myself, I'm always interested in where things come from and where things have started. Now, you mentioned that you cannot really be illiberal if you haven't first experienced liberalism. And it also seems that liberalism and illiberalism are tied to the nation state, if it's about national sovereignty. So I guess that makes illiberalism a typically modern phenomenon. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for me, it's something modern that you cannot really use the term in a conceptually useful way if you move before the 80s. So for me, it's really, you need to have the kind of the neoliberal transformation of social democracy in the West, beginning in the 80s with Reagan in the US, Thatcher in the UK, to then have the backlash as we see it now. But of course, you have ideological continuity with some older phenomenon. If you think about, I don't know, Weimar Republic, you also had an illiberal backlash against a liberal regime at that time. So I think it's useful to have the historical kind of perspective and to look at the doctrinal, the genealogy of illiberalism. But if you want to use it as a useful concept to understand what is happening now, for me, it's something that began like 50 years ago maximum.
Yeah. So as a precise term in the precise sense that you're using it, it has only crystallized recently, but you can find bits and pieces of it already in earlier time periods, or things that are similar to it in some ways.
Exactly, because you had previously kind of liberalism being challenged is not a new phenomenon, right? It got challenged in 19th century, it got challenged at the end of the First World War and during the interwar period. So you can make the parallel, and that's interesting historical parallels, but I still think that what we have now is a very modern phenomenon, because you need economic neoliberalism, you need globalization to have the backlash, and you need the transformation of the media ecosystem to have the backlash we have now.
Yeah. So not only is it a recent phenomenon, but it's also very current in the sense that we seem to see a lot of illiberal politicians and a lot of illiberalism about us nowadays. So why does it appear that liberalism is so appealing at the moment, and not just in just one country, but it seems all over the globe we get illiberalist risings? Why is that?
Well, because I think a large part of the countries in the world have been going through some element of shared, transformation. Of course, each time you have national contexts that are important, but many countries have experienced neoliberalism and globalization. They have experienced kind of rise of individualism against collective identity. They have experienced this acceleration of time, that everything should be done like we live in this kind of immediacy time, and social media are kind of amplifying that. And we have a global distrust of classic institution, and that works for, the broad Western world, that works for Latin America, for the Middle East, that works for Asia. So I think that's the kind of the fertile soil that then make illiberalism as a political project possible to emerge, because a large part of the world has been going through this very kind of systemic transformation.
Yeah. So do you think that the internet and social media bringing the world closer together, as it were, has also played a role in this?
Yeah, I think you have some transnational borrowing and kind of mirror game and influence that have been as play. But I think what is really a key element related to media is the media ecosystem has become so much more commercial and kind of, clickbait based, that it's also pushing for everything polarizing and not for things that are unifying or accentuating the cohesion of the national group. So I think that is also a global phenomenon that has been impacting, that is creating that soil for illiberalism to rise. Yeah,
indeed. So you mentioned that illiberalism, it's all about national sovereignty. It's about what you call rootedness, being rooted in your own local place, being a somewhere and not an anywhere, I guess, and having that connection to the land and to your own culture rather than being a cosmopolitan. And yet at the same time, perhaps paradoxically, it seems illiberalism is a very cosmopolitan in the sense of global movement, and a lot of illiberal leaders and politicians are talking to each other. I remember a few years ago that Viktor Orban in Hungary hosted this big conference, and a lot of illiberal politicians went there to discuss things and to exchange ideas. So there seems to be quite a global network, even though they're all harping on being rooted in their own national culture. Can you explain that paradox? Why does it work that way?
Well, I think it's not so much a paradox if you think that we live in a globalized world. So even those who promote non-globalized ideology are also partly globalized, right? And so what happened with illiberal movement is that first they borrowed techniques coming from the left, and social activism and kind of transnational connection coming from the left. So they were also interested in this kind of transnational aspect of activism. Then you have the old tradition of kind of transnational links coming from the US evangelical movement, going to Africa, going to Latin America and making connection with other religious movement and you already had this also long tradition, what was called the Baptist Burqa relationship, right, of radical US evangelical connected with radical Muslims in fighting kind of global secular institution. So you have all that backgrounds were there, and it got reinforced in the last, 20 years with kind of geopolitical agenda playing a role. So US big conservative illiberal funders trying to fund, groups in Europe, especially Russia becoming a very important player on this illiberal world scene by also funding its own partners. It has changed with the war now, but it was there until last year. And you have the US evangelical tradition, you have Russia's soft power toward European illiberal leaders, and then you have also a growing Catholic fundamentalist kind of transnational linked arriving. If you follow CPAC in the US and their connection with Spain, with Mexico, and so on, you can see that it's also, you have all these transnational networks that are working together. They may have each their different contexts, but they work together in trying to put pressure on the liberal system itself and trying to kind of dismantle it partly.
Yeah, so you're living and working in the US, but you have a French background, and I presume you also keep an eye on French politics. So do you see parallel developments there in terms of illiberalism, or are they very distinct? In the US brand of illiberalism, is that very different from the French or broader the European brand of illiberalism?
Well, they function in a different political system, right? So the French political system would be economically much more leftist than the US one, and much more liberal in terms of more and values and sexuality than in the US framework, where you have still a very strong conservative constituency. So they have to adapt. But if you look at the way Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Rally, has been transforming her identity to feed the general mood and to continue to be, or to promote herself as an illiberal political leader and no more the leader of a marginal far-right party, I think you can make parallel. And some people around her were connected to, Trump and Bannon, and she had a strong connection with Russia. The whole Le Pen family had a strong connection with Russia. They went to Budapest to see Orban. So you can see all these networks at work, and they function especially well in the European framework, because you have the EU construction that is inviting them to work at the European level and to be influential at the European Parliament. So the EU level is also specifically transnational.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So I guess it's partly also a question of where you stand yourself on politics, but many people consider illiberalism as a movement that is concerning and something that we should keep an eye on, or even perhaps a threat to the political order in the broadest sense of the word. Do you think illiberalism is indeed posing a threat? And if indeed it is, then what should we do about it?
Well, I think it's posing a threat because liberalism is failing at delivering its promise. So I think there is a fertile soil for illiberalism to rise. And in fact, if you look globally, what is happening in Europe, at least, and partly in the US, you see that what was seen before are the kind of the liberal consensus, right? This kind of mainstream liberalism that we had since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disappearance of the two blocs. It's getting challenged both by the right and by the left, because you also have a revival of the left. So of course they don't have the same political project, the right and the left, or the rightist illiberalism and the left, but they both challenge liberal mainstream on a pretty similar aspect. They challenge economic neoliberalism, they challenge the superficiality or the technocratic aspect of liberalism. They challenge liberalism as a technocratic supranational project disconnected from everyday, democratic processes. They have, of course, depending if you are right or left, totally different vision of cultural liberalism, but they still share a lot, I think, on their vision of why liberalism as it is now doesn't function anymore. So I think it's creating challenges, and I think it's the job of the liberal world to try to answer this challenge by addressing grievances, because grievances are real, that people are expressing. And so for me as a scholar, it's always important to dissociate this level, see that you may discuss, Orban, Trump, Putin as leaders who instrumentalized illiberalism to stay in power, have a kleptocratic, nepotic system. But the grievances expressed by their voters are real, and this one should be addressed. If you want to dismantle illiberalism as a political system, you need to address the grievances that are expressed by those who are supporting them. So it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that we need to address also. So it's a good challenge in a sense.
Yeah, that's very clear. And I guess that's also leading up to my next question, because among your many job titles, you are the director of the Illiberalism Studies Program. Can you tell us a bit more about what you're trying to do, you and your colleagues in that program, what you're trying to achieve?
So we try to explore this concept, trying to build it, and we are now finishing the Oxford Handbook of Illiberalism that will be published by the end of the year. So there will be 45 chapters. There already have been a Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism with 60 chapters. So if you put all these two handbooks together, there will be like 100 articles kind of trying to work on the concept from different fields. So we work on establishing the concept, its limits, its validity. We also are interested in creating networks of scholars from different area studies. So having the US side and the European side of scholarship discussing and connected with what is happening outside of the global West. There are great scholarship done in Latin America and in some countries of Asia that are really talking to each other. So we try to put all these people in dialogue, and we also try to not to be normative in the way we look and play with the concept, and also trying to be a kind of a platform for discussion that's maybe discussing, like post-liberalism, how do we want to change the system, reform it. So we try not to be judgmental too much or too much normative, and give the floor to people who have pretty different polarized opinion, but we think it's necessary to be able for them to dialogue if we want to be able to move forward.
Yeah, thanks. So as you know, at the CARP Research Lab, we specialize in and we study what we call character assassination. So the blackening of people's reputation, and we study reputation management. So in June, we're going to host this joint conference, Character Assassination, Illiberalism, and the Erosion of Civic Rights here in Amsterdam. So obviously, there is a connection between illiberalism and character assassination. But can you elaborate a bit more on that? How do these two themes that we're interested in, how do they connect to each other?
Yeah, I think they have a connection that needs to be explored, and I guess the June conference will be largely working on that. So here also, it's not full overlap, right? You can have character assassination and any kind of rhetorical incivilities in a liberal framework. Mm-hmm. But of course, you will have illiberal leaders and thinkers, opinion leaders who will be interested in using character assassination because polarization is a key element of illiberalism, right? The personalization of politics is also an important element. And the fact that politics and entertainment are getting largely overlapping, I think is contributing for illiberal leaders to be very strong in character assassination. And there was a great work done by the Austrian linguist Ruth Wodak. If maybe some of you know her, she had a great collective research on shameless normalization of impoliteness, and she was looking at Berlusconi and Trump. And I think it's a good way to see how much illiberal figures are able to challenge the kind of the political correctness of the liberal consensus and trying to return back the arguments against liberalism by being much more vocal on the way they are criticizing their opponents. So I think there is this kind of ideological affinity between character assassination and illiberalism that is happening. But here also it's happening because we have this kind of systemic structural transformation of the media ecosystem and the political field in our society that allow them to kind of merge.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Chat by Deirdre Jane Friggy. Have you studied how accusations of illiberalism are used as a character assassination tool or in an attempt to deplatform / marginalize / ostracize certain voices?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think indeed that has been used. And I think that's one of the problems, that these terms of illiberalism is now used in the kind of the media space as a way to kind of silence those who are considered as not sharing the same values. I didn't work on that specifically, but I worked on how the notion of fascism was used to also marginalize some of political actors, and it was published in the handbook of the CARP team. So I think it's the same happening, in that this notion, anyone who is challenging what is considered as mainstream narratives can be very easily accused of being illiberal, and so that's used as a kind of ostracizing rhetorical tool.
Yeah, it can be a very convenient label to discredit your opponent. So Zaid, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you for having me. I attended a webinar recently about next systems, relationship between democracy and executive power. And one of the quotes from Simone Bolivar that stuck with me was, "Nothing is as dangerous with respect to the people as weakness in executive power. In a republic, the executive should be the strongest power because everything conspires against him." So from this, what do you think about the relationship between illiberalism, democracy, and executive power? Is there like an intermingling relationship between all three of those, or does executive power have a different relationship with mode of government versus illiberalism?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think executive power can work well in a liberal system, but of course, at any moment you would have a kind of change of public opinion mood, or a leader being able to capture that executive power. If you don't have a kind of institutional check and balance mechanism with any more independent kind of parliamentary system, you are at risk of a rapid personalization of power, right? And so I think that's one of what we have been seeing, like, I mean, I'm not sure the US would be the best example in that case, but when the leader is able to capture a state decision without kind of counterbalancing institutions such as the parliament, it's kind of accelerating the shift toward illiberalism. I think one of the problems is that for many citizens, when you look at, you know, the surveys we have for people who are voting for illiberal leaders, one of their vision is that they don't understand how democracy is functioning, because the democratic mechanisms are very opaque. You know, institutionally, if you are not versed in everyday politics, it's difficult to understand why it takes so long to take decision, why you need to have so many check and balances, why you cannot change the world so easily, right? So you have a gap between what politicians are saying they will be able to do and what the kind of institutional and economic inertia is not allowing them to do. And so I think what people are expressing when they are voting or supporting a liberal figure is that they're expressing this kind of distrust. Why is democracy so slow and so opaque to change my world? And that's where you have this kind of, you know, strong leader, executive power arriving with this idea that if you can bypass institution and just have the leader able to make changes, then it will be more functional, it will work better and faster. And I think that's one of the big risks we have in our society, is that the more politics is getting limited on what you can really do and change, the more there will be a call for people to hope that, you know, you will bypass institution and a strong leader will be able to change the kind of everyday life. So that's how I would see this articulation.
Yeah, okay. Eric?
Thank you, Marlène. Very interesting and insightful. Thank you so much. International relations question. I will be brief and precise, I hope. During the Cold War, we all learned that biggest source of global conflict was ideological, when we see that almost half of countries joined forces against communism, including colonial powers like Portugal, juntas like Argentina, and liberal democracies like Denmark, together against communism. Then we had, as we thought, the flat world period, and then Huntington predicted cultural clashes as foundations of our confrontation global scale. Didn't happen, looks like. Do you think that we see today a situation when authoritarian and illiberal regimes join forces together to resist liberalism and the new ideological clash of civilizations taking place?
Yeah, great question, Eric. I think what you are having now is the collapse of this flat world, right? This idea that liberalism is the obvious answer that should be shared by all. That, I think, is collapsing. But what is coming in front of that collapse and accelerating it, it's a multiplicity of non-liberal solutions, right? So I don't believe in this kind of huge coalition of illiberal leaders really working close to each other and calling each other, you know, to coordinate their action. They are all thinking about their own country and their own power. What they are doing is transactional politics, right? That if it's good for Erdogan to work with Putin, he will do it. If it's not good for him, he will not do it. And that's how it works, right? So it's no more a world funded on kind of long-term collective alliance. It will be transactional geopolitics. And in that case, being an illiberal leader is much more make your life easier, because you can change your alliance and be transactional in a much easier way than the US and NATO and Europe can do, for example. So I think what you will see, and so it's accelerating this kind of multipolarization of the world, and that will look more chaotic because all this kind of liberal kind of obviousness is gradually collapsing, and then you will have changing alliance, transactional geopolitics happening, and I think, as I was saying, that it will be much more difficult for the liberal powers to manage because they are acting in a slower way, where a transactional illiberal leader can make decisions fast. And I think that's what we are saying. So I don't believe in the kind of the big alliance of, you know, authoritarian leader against liberal world order, but their own strategies cumulated to each other is indeed challenging the system.
Yeah, okay. There's a question from Mary in the chat. When you talk about getting to the root of grievances to solve problems, do you think that all grievances are legitimate? How do you define grievances and the validity of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know if all grievances are legitimate. They are legitimate as a human, you know, a belief and expression of. So if you look at the cultural anthropologists, I think you would consider that each grievances need to be heard. Are they legitimate politically? No, of course not. All of them are legitimate politically. But I think we have enough research that has been done now on the kind of the sociological roots of the rise of illiberalism to see that it's very much connected to feeling of insecurity expressed by not only by the poorest social groups of the society, but also by middle classes getting afraid of being pauperized, right? So I think the globalization and the kind of change in our political culture over the last 20 years are made some social groups feeling losers of all this transformation, and they are the one whose grievances should be at least partly heard. But then, of course, we can discuss, I mean, some, I don't know, you have a lot of grievances you take the US context that are racist-based, and so you will not consider them as legitimate in a liberal system, but very often you have intersectionality of grievances, right? So you also have studies showing, like, I don't know, you know, white blue-collar men voting for Trump are also expressing not only, I don't know, a racist and sexist opinion, they are also expressing a social class identity that needs to be heard on one way or another. So I think all the knowledge we have on intersectionality, usually for the left, is also useful if we want to understand what is happening on the rightist side of the political spectrum.
Another question from Leah. What do you think would be necessary for the weakening of illiberal government and leaders? Would it be the functioning of democratic institutions, etc.?
Yeah, I think liberalism just needs to be better and solve its own issues. If you look, on the international scene, I mean, the Global South is expressing genuine grievances about the disequilibrium of world representation, at UN, in the world, in the big international financial institution, the gap between, rich and poor in the world. So you have a lot of grievances on the international scene, and of course in each domestic context, that I think are worth getting discussed, because they are the ones that are creating this soil for illiberalism. But you also have other political solutions, more kind of leftist solutions, that are also emerging, right? So illiberalism is not the only one, but I think addressing what is the core of the issue is the only way. And then you can have partial solution, like considering you should deplatform radical far-right, that you want, radical far-right groups to be outside and not being allowed to speak. But all that is only solving a minor issue, which is the way narratives can spread, but it's not addressing what is the core kind of grassroots issue of disequilibrium or disbalances in our political system.
Yeah, so Benny asks, and I guess that taps into the same thing, how has the right been able to turn liberalism into a negative term and to simplify and stain the concept? How have they been able to pull that off?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, and that is in fact going well also with, there are questions about people have forgotten what is liberalism. And I think that the point is that political liberalism, which is our civil rights and us being respected as individual and avoiding being coerced by other groups or by the state, it's getting forgotten because people associate liberalism with economic neoliberalism, or when they are on the rightist side of the political spectrum, with cultural liberalism. So everything about kind of emancipatory, tradition, emancipatory strategies from sexual and ethnic identities. And so I think that the point is that economic liberalism and cultural emancipatory liberalism are making people forgetting that the key issue is their political rights. And so indeed now illiberal leaders are playing on these two tools to kind of push away political rights. And I think that's the danger, that political liberalism is the forgotten piece of the debates. Well, in fact, it's the key one for many people. People don't want to lose their individual rights. It's just that they don't see it anymore as relevant and as efficient. Right, and they are thinking about economic liberalism being an issue, and for those with conservative views, as they see cultural liberalism as an issue.
Yeah, Deirdre says, I often feel like both the public and our political leaders in liberal systems take liberalism for granted because we have forgotten what came before it and what it emerged to solve. However, I do not see this changing until we make a positive case for liberalism that goes beyond shallow assertions about democracy and freedom. This seems to lead to the response, well, what has this democracy freedom done for me? Are there any examples of leaders who are trying to make this positive case for liberalism in a way that is responsive to people's concerns? Do you see any path forward? So
for me, the fact that liberalism is getting challenged now, what the majority of people are saying is that democracy and freedom, if you cannot exercise it fully, it's just losing part of its meaning. And the way to exercise it freely is also to have more equality or equity. And so I think it's the question of kind of, redistribution, both economic redistribution, but also redistribution of symbolic politics that people want to see arriving as part of what they define as liberalism. Right, so I think for me, the kind of redistributive aspect, both economically and symbolically, is the key solution for liberalism to be rescued. Because just a narrative on freedom is not enough. It doesn't speak to everyday life. Everyday life is not about freedom, not only about freedom. Or once you have freedom, it's not enough. You need to exercise your freedom. You need some form of redistribution or equality. So for me, that's the key issue. And I think you have, in different countries, you have politicians who realize that and know that it's the key element, will they be able to make that change in the current system where politicians have a more and more limited room of action and of being transformative is becoming more and more difficult for politicians. And so I think that's one of the challenges also, is that globally politics is less and less efficient in transforming life.
Yeah. So Tyler says, to what extent, if any, are scholars attempting to measure public support for illiberalism? It strikes me that a lot of the conversation on this topic, unsurprisingly, is focused on elites and institutions, but the public opinion researcher in me is trying to turn a lot in your East European politics piece into survey questions.
Yeah, I think so far, because as I said, the literature on illiberalism was mostly coming from political science. It was mostly about institution and regime types, you know, voting, party voting, but not about public opinion. At the same time, if you look at the big surveys we have, you know, World Value Survey, European Value Survey, and a lot of national surveys, you can capture some form, you can capture people's anxiety, you can capture the way people formulate fears and grievances. You can also capture how people react, you know, to the rapid kind of cultural changes. We have a lot of data on, you know, relationship to change in kind of gender relations, in kind of relationship to immigration. So all this transformation of kind of citizenship and what makes us living together, you have that data. I think it just hasn't been really used and correlated by the literature. I think you have also a great contribution coming from psychology. Because in a sense, we are maybe each of us we are both liberal and illiberal in us, right? We can have both elements. We can have fear. We can have need for security. We can have need for identity, you know, feeling of coziness. You know, we want to be among the one that we feel are like us. So I think psychology at the individual level can also bring a lot in the discussion to understand the kind of the popular support for a liberal leader. It's not all about, you know, like poor public opinion being brainwashed by their leaders. I think you have also things happening at the society level, transformation, that are important to take into consideration.
Eric, I saw that you had another question. Please go ahead if you want to.
Certainly. Thank you so much. Marlène, a political psychology question, and then briefly, thank you for your really excellent distinction between people's experience with liberalism and having not such experience, and then the one, consequence can be liberalism, the other authoritarianism. Excellent. But what do you think? I still think that authoritarianism in many forms is a sort of a potential preventive illiberalism, because those political leaders, generals and others, they are aware of liberalism. And that's why what they do, they want to prevent it from happening institutionally, also politically. What do you think? It's still liberalism is a more general view concept compared to authoritarianism.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, I mean, people may want a strong leader, right? May want authoritarian solution, may want law and order. And if you look in surveys, you see also, right, that it's there in the public opinion. You look at European public opinion, each time you have a big terrorist act in Europe, you have a peak in public opinion because of fear of wanting kind of more authoritarian solution and so on. So, but then when it's transformed, when it's become a regime type, then it creates the kind of vicious circle. If you look at Orban, I think it's a good example for Hungary of a leader who got democratically elected for representing some form of illiberalism, and who, the longer he stays in power, the more he can transform the society in making it less and less democratic. But I still think that conceptually, we don't want illiberalism and authoritarianism to overlap, right? Because otherwise, every authoritarian regime is not illiberal. As I said, I don't put China in the category of an illiberal regime, authoritarian for sure, but not illiberal. And then I think you want to keep illiberalism in the public opinion, illiberalism as the grievances, illiberalism as part of your mood of the day, you know, available and detached from authoritarianism as a regime type.
Yeah, so I think we'll have to leave it at that. So thanks, Marlène, for that wonderful interview and for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm sure that we've all learned a lot, and there may still be many more questions, but those may be addressed at another occasion. I want to thank everyone for attending.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was great to see you all. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you all for a great conversation.
Bye-bye.